Hello and welcome back to another episode of Written for Admonition, Studies in the Old Testament. We're wrapping up our discussion about the wisdom books with a conversation about time. I'll tell you ahead of our conversation here that I had planned to go a different direction with this originally. My first thought was to go through Proverbs and talk about the importance of diligence and why we want to avoid laziness, and I think those are important lessons. But the more that I thought about it and the more that I considered specifically the book of Ecclesiastes, which is where we're going to be spending our time in this particular discussion, I realized that there was a broader point about time that I wanted to cover more than what Proverbs has to say. So I would definitely encourage you to read through Proverbs for what it tells us about how to use time, and again, diligence, avoiding laziness, those types of topics. But that's not going to be our focus in this particular episode. Instead, I really want to talk more about human mortality. That's a broader point in the Old Testament that speaks to a lot of situations. You have passages in the law, you have passages in the Psalms, you have passages in the prophets that all wrestle in different ways with the brevity of life. And this is something that you and I know pretty well. We may not know it as well as others, we might have experienced the same level of loss that others have, but no matter who we are, we know that life is fleeting. We know that life has an end, that it doesn't go on forever, that even if we live into our 90s, hundreds, 110s, however long we are blessed to live, we recognize that at some point we have to depart. And that brevity has inspired a lot of these passages and given us a lot of things to consider from what they teach us. And I believe that God has blessed us with texts like what we're going to be considering today that help us to really think about how to use our time in the right way, knowing the perspective that we ought to have about how brief life is. Now, that's not to say that any book in the Old Testament has a perfect answer about the use of time, or has a perfect answer about how we should view time. But they do give us a mindset and a perspective that helps us to see time for what it is. And more than that, not only seeing time for what it is, but looking to God, who is the creator of time, the creator of all things, who does have the answers that we're seeking, who is able to provide us with comfort and help through the difficulties we might have in this life because of time. And so again, just to reiterate about Proverbs, we have lessons there about time and how to use it wisely. But in Ecclesiastes, we are looking at a mindset, a perspective that we have on time and the use of it, and why it is what it is. So it really causes us to think deeply about what time is and what it means and why it matters so much to our lives and how we ought to respond to that, really. So before we get into Ecclesiastes and the text of it, just to level set about what this book really represents. Ecclesiastes is interesting because it's another book written by Solomon, and it's a book that reflects upon Solomon's own experiences. At least that's what we can gather from what is written in the book. And Solomon here, likely at the end of his own life, is reflecting on how he's lived his life and the things that he has done, how nothing was withheld from him. Remember, again, we've talked about this before, that Solomon was the wealthiest king who has ever lived. In fact, to this day, he is still the wealthiest man who ever lived, even apart from him being the king. So he had everything that you could ever imagine. Every luxury, every pleasure, everything that you could possibly envision in your mind one person possessing and using, he had it and he did. And in this book, he comes to the conclusion that those things really didn't matter, that he didn't find fulfillment in those things. And that's really what Ecclesiastes is all about, is not finding fulfillment in this life and what this life has to offer, because we recognize there's something beyond this life, and that is where we can find true fulfillment. So we're going to talk about that as well. Well, let's go ahead and go into Ecclesiastes here and talk about chapter 3 as our starting point here. You likely have heard this passage in passing. You may have read this before, talking about how there's a time for every season and a purpose for all these different things that go on. Let's go ahead and read this passage. And I want you to have an open mind reading this, to not see it the way that it's usually presented. I have heard this presented in sermons as a beautiful passage, very poetic, very heartwarming. I don't think that's the intention that Solomon has here, just to be honest and upfront about that. And I'll explain why that is in just a moment once we read this passage. So go ahead and join me here in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. We're starting in verse 1, and we'll just read down to verse 8 together. To everything there is a season, verse 1 says, a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to gain and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. When you first read that, it's easy to understand why someone might recognize this as a beautiful piece of poetry, because in some sense it is. Obviously it's poetic, but what is the intention behind it in the context of Ecclesiastes? Because as I've already mentioned, we're talking about a book that's presenting itself as the one that is trying to teach us why seeking fulfillment in this life is not worth it. This actually bolsters that claim quite powerfully. Because notice how the author presents all these things. It's not as though we have control over these times. It's not as though we get to choose when we're born. We don't get to choose when we die. We have some control over some of the things mentioned here, obviously, so I'm not trying to present it as though everything is predetermined or anything like that, and I don't think that's what Ecclesiastes is doing either, by the way. But it's just saying these things happen in life, and there's not a great degree of control over them. It just is what it is. We have to do these things. And it's presented that way. It's offered up that way. And it is presented in the avenue of poetry. But let's not lose sight of what Ecclesiastes is trying to tell us here, that time cannot be controlled. That time is not something that we can grasp and that we can manipulate to our own benefit. It's something that slips away from us very easily. And it's something where we don't control when the time to weep is going to come or the time to laugh is going to come. We have control over our perspective, sure. We have control over our actions. But as far as things coming upon us or different situations, that is not something that's directly in our control. And I think that's what Ecclesiastes is trying to teach us here, because it's trying to help us level set with the idea that we don't have total control over everything that goes on. That trying to control these different factors or trying to find fulfillment in these different factors, it's a waste of time. It is not a wise thing to do. So it's trying to teach us that mindfulness and that awareness of how finite time is and how little control over it we really have. So going back to our slideshow here, there's two main things, and I've already kind of touched on these a little bit. But notice here that we have these situations that are common to all people. So everybody at some point and in some sense deals with these things. Now you could mention that there's caveats here, that it doesn't apply to everyone equally. That's true. But you can see how everybody would be able to relate to this in some sense, that even if one doesn't apply, the other one does. Certainly we talk about being born, dying, all these different things, that applies to everybody equally. But regardless of how we see it, we understand these are common experiences. And the fact that it's so common and across the board, it doesn't matter if you're someone who is very wise and very discerning. It doesn't matter if you're someone who is very foolish and undiscerning. It doesn't matter if you're someone who's extremely wealthy or extremely impoverished. It doesn't really matter what your station of life is. It doesn't matter the color of your skin. It doesn't matter your gender even. These things that are going on here in Ecclesiastes 3 happen to everybody in some sense. Everybody is subject to this. Time doesn't play favorites. It doesn't have a situation where someone can pay more money to extend their time. So we understand that it's common to all people, that everyone experiences this in some sense, and that no matter what they try to do, they cannot control it. But here's another perspective I think this teaches us in Ecclesiastes 3 about time. It depicts all these things as necessary. So when we read through this initially, we are going to have a more positive association with some of the things and a negative association with others. And obviously, we're going to prefer the times of laughter. We're going to prefer the times of dancing. We're going to prefer the times of embracing. We're going to prefer the times of gain. We're going to prefer what we deem to be more positive. But what Ecclesiastes is doing here is showing that actually there's a balance to this, that these things have to exist simultaneously in many cases, or they have to be together. There is a time for both things. It's not an either or, because both are going to factor in at some point or another. And we have to accept that reality too, that although we don't want to suffer, we don't want to see others suffer, we don't want to be people who are in that situation, that actually that is necessary and it's a part of what life is. And that if we were to always have this joy and always to have this pleasure and always to have these good times, then would they really have the meaning of good times, is kind of the thought that's being communicated here in Ecclesiastes 3. But even more than those 2 points together is the point that is made actually in verse 11 of chapter 3. We won't read it here, but I would encourage you to read through that in just a moment. But Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 11 tells us that God has put within our hearts a sense of eternity. In other words, he's helped us to understand and grasp that there's more to life and there's more to what is out there than just what this life has to offer. That there is eternity waiting. And he's put that within our hearts to seek that out, to seek out the divine, to seek out what is beyond this life. And the fact that we can recognize that there is something is important. But the idea that Ecclesiastes presents in verse 11 is that we want to seek God out. We want to seek out the eternity that he has promised and make sure that we're laboring to that end and using our time for that purpose. So the idea is that we can't control time. We have no control over when these different seasons are going to affect us. We don't have control over whether or not we're going to have the time to weep or the time to laugh, as an example. We don't necessarily know when those are going to be. But what we can do with the time that we are given is make the most of what has been given. To not squander our time on wasteful things. To not just view time as something that, well, it doesn't really matter, because it most certainly does. That even though we can't control it, we can utilize it for the benefit of our own souls and the souls of others. And we can use that time to seek God out while there is still time and recognize Him in all things that we do. That's really what Ecclesiastes 3 is communicating. So it's not just a beautiful piece of poetry. It's far more than that. It's a greater statement about the brevity of life, a greater statement about the uncontrollable nature of time, and the reality that there's a balance in life and that we need those good times and those bad times both to help us appreciate what life is all about. So having said that, let's go a little bit further and build on this idea of prioritizing God. Now, Ecclesiastes is pretty unique in the way that it does this. So chapter 3 has already shown that concept, that you want to use your time to prioritize God, to seek Him out because of who He is and the answers that He can give. But it goes further than that as you go through the book. Now, obviously, we're jumping from chapter 3 into chapter 12 here, so we're making a pretty big leap here. There's a lot in between there that goes over the same topic. But these are the two I wanted to focus on because they directly deal with the topic at hand, time. So in chapter 12 of Ecclesiastes, you have this presentation of the fleeting nature of youth, and how youth is here one moment and is gone the next. And before you know it, you end up being an older person. You end up facing a lot of difficulties and trials in life that are happening within your body. And then, of course, the day to die comes. But let's go ahead and just read Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 1 through 8 for what it is. And then we'll talk about some of what it says. And then the brighter conclusion that it comes to at the end of the book, which actually really is the whole point that's been made throughout the body of the work. So let's go ahead and take a look at Ecclesiastes 12. Let's start with verse 1 and read on down to verse 8 together. Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come, and the years draw near when you say, I have no pleasure in them. While the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are not darkened, and the clouds do not return after the rain. In the day when the keepers of the house tremble, and the strong men bow down, when the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look through the windows grow dim, when the windows are shut in the streets, and the sound of grinding is low, when one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of music are brought low. Also they are afraid of height, and of terrors in the way, when the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper is a burden, and desire fails. For man goes to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. Remember your Creator before the silver cord is loosed, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the well. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. There's a lot of detail we could get into here about what is being communicated, but let me just sum it up this way. You have in verses 1 through 2 the idea presented there of remembering God while there is time in your youth, of not being wasteful and neglectful of Him in your younger days, which, again, we think about common experience, that's exactly what happens. Generally speaking, not speaking for every situation, but generally speaking, young people are wasteful. They use their youth for dumb things. They expend it on things that are quite useless in the long run of life. They may not see it the same way, but that's the truth of what happens. But going forward in life and not being wasteful, hopefully not being wasteful, there is the still reality of growing older. And there's these different difficulties that come upon us as we grow older. Our vision becomes difficult. It dims a little bit. We can't see as well as we did. We can't hear as well as we did. Our strength leaves us. We can't lift heavy objects without straining ourselves or even injuring ourselves if we're not careful. We are not able to get out and do as much as we once did because we're just simply unable to get out of the house as much. We're afraid of different things that previously we never would have been afraid of. And on Ecclesiastes goes here, not to present to us this depressing picture of life. It might seem that way when you go through it. But remember the key point we mentioned at the beginning of this particular discussion. It's presenting a picture of life lived apart from God, where there really is no hope and there's no mindfulness of eternity. And that although these things are going to happen, as we're going to get to at the conclusion in just a moment, we recognize that with God, these things don't have to be feared. That there is something better for us, that God will help us through these things. He will carry us through these difficult days. But if we try to live life apart from God and we seek fulfillment outside of Him, we're not going to be in for a good time. But we see in this the brevity of life. We see how one day we're young and the next day we're old. And we see how, as we get older, it just keeps getting worse as far as our health, and we have more and more problems and greater issues. They just come up, and the list grows and grows and grows and becomes worse. It's not a good situation. But it's the reality of the situation. And Ecclesiastes puts this out there, and it really causes us to reflect and think carefully about our lives and to recognize just how important it is to not be wasteful with our time, to not be a people who see time as just something to ignore, something to just brush aside and say, that doesn't really matter, but to instead take time seriously, to prioritize the things that need to be prioritized and to make sure we have things balanced. And that's not saying that Ecclesiastes doesn't say there's a time for pleasure and a time for fun. You go throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, that's a lesson that's repeated multiple times in the book. So the writer here is not trying to tell us to not have fun and just to be very serious about all things. It's not that at all. But it's saying to have a balance and to not go too far in any one direction, as you might expect from Old Testament teaching, where we see that even in the books of law. So going back to our slideshow here just briefly, we see the importance of seeking God out. We see the importance of not taking time for granted and making sure we're using it wisely. And that brings us down to chapter 12, verses 13 through 14. Now here in this particular passage, we have the summary of the whole book of Ecclesiastes and everything we've really said up to this point. I could have started and finished with this passage, and it would have pretty much captured everything that we needed to say, but had a little more detail I wanted to give it as we go through this. But the goal above all in verses 13 and 14 is to fear God and keep his commandments, because that is our all. That really is our all. That is what our lives are all about. It's that life that is lived to seek out God. It's a life that is lived to fear him and to keep his commandments, to do what pleases him, to be people who look to him in all situations and are not afraid of time, are not afraid of what time brings to us, but instead recognize that God has things under control. He knows what he's doing. We don't have to be afraid. We have no reason to have this fear in our hearts about what's going to happen next, because we already have a sense of what will happen next. He has told us these things. So we want to make sure that we're seeking him out. We're prioritizing him above everything else in this life, knowing the importance of that. How our prioritization of God will endure beyond this life. It's not something that ends now. It's something that goes even further. But if we prioritize the things of this life, we seek fulfillment in this life, we're going to find it was wasted time. And that's certainly not going to be something we want to face. So to sum all of this up, we need to recognize just bluntly and plainly that time is undefeated. There's not a one of us listening to this at this moment who will not have to face the difficulties of time if we haven't already, or if we're not currently. We all understand the burden of time. We know how troublesome it is. We know that it isn't easy to put up with, and we sometimes wonder why. But with God, we understand that there's a purpose in these things, that it teaches us lessons we otherwise wouldn't learn. It helps us to become better people and stronger people to face these trials and these circumstances that we face, and to support others who might be enduring similar situations, and to keep our minds and our hopes focused where our hopes and our minds need to be, on what God has promised us and the glory that awaits us. So we can be in a place that God has given us that's unburdened by time, where we don't have to worry about the days passing by, and we don't have to worry about the day of our death looming over us. We no longer have to be concerned about those things. And God has promised to those faithful to him that that reality will unfold for them if they live by faith and do what is pleasing in his sight, fearing him and keeping his commandments. So let's be people who use our time wisely, yes. But more than that, let's be people who see time for what it is, and that we don't see it as something to ignore, something to neglect, something to pretend like it doesn't exist, but rather to embrace it for what it is, to understand that God is in total control of it, and that we trust him no matter the situation. I hope this lesson has helped you in some respect, that it's been enlightening, especially considering the book of Ecclesiastes. I know this, when we go through a book like Ecclesiastes, there are so many details we could get into, and so much that we're having to ignore as we go through this just because of the time that we have. But I do hope it's been helpful to you in some sense. We're looking forward to our next discussions we're going to have from the books of the Psalms there, and so we'll go through those, and we'll have a good time with that. As always, I thank you for your time and attention to this lesson, and we'll pick up again very soon. Thank you.